In 1932, a woman named Margaret Calloway had $11, 3 children, and a husband who hadn't worked in 14 months. The bank had taken the house. The car was gone. They were living in a converted barn outside of Gary, Indiana, with a wood stove and a vegetable patch the size of a parking space. By 1945, Margaret owned a 2-story home, debt-free. She had $600 in a tin box under the floorboards, which in today's money is roughly $12,000, and a root cellar stocked with enough food to last 2 years. She didn't win anything. She didn't inherit anything. She didn't get lucky. She used 7 skills that the United States government literally paid agents to document during the 1930s because officials were terrified they would disappear forever. Skills that, when applied together, created a compounding financial effect so powerful that economists who study that generation still can't fully explain how families earning almost nothing managed to build such lasting stability. Here's the part that should disturb you. Those 7 skills are almost completely gone. And in the vacuum they left behind, the Federal Reserve's own data shows that 37% of American adults today, more than 1 in 3 people in the wealthiest economy in human history, cannot cover a $400 emergency without going into debt. A single car repair, a broken tooth, 1 bad week. That's the gap. And Margaret Calloway, with $11 and a barn, would have looked at that statistic and not understood it. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly what she knew. And I'm going to show you in real numbers what happens to your financial life when you apply even 3 of these skills consistently over 10 years. Stay with me, because skill number 4 is the one that surprises everyone. And it's the one the system specifically designed you to forget. Before we go into the skills, I want to set something up. Every time we go through one of these skills, I'm going to add a number to a running total, real numbers based on average American household data. By the time we reach skill 7, you're going to see a cumulative figure that I think is going to genuinely change how you look at your own spending. Think of it as Margaret's ledger. She kept one. Most people who built wealth from nothing kept one. We're going to build ours together. The first thing Margaret did was refuse to pay anyone for something she could produce herself. This sounds obvious. It isn't. Because the modern economy has spent 100 years engineering the feeling that making things yourself is inefficient. That your time is worth more than the cost of buying it already done. That is one of the most expensive lies ever told. Here's what it costs in real money. The average American household spends roughly $3,200 a year on food away from home. Takeout, restaurants, meal kits, pre-made grocery items. The Bureau of Labor Statistics tracks this. That number has more than doubled in inflation-adjusted terms since the 1970s. Margaret spent nothing on that category. 0. She baked bread from flour. She made soup from bones. She stretched a single chicken across 4 meals because the USDA's own Bureau of Home Economics published a pamphlet in 1933 showing exactly how to do it, and families across the country followed it. You don't have to go that far. Replacing 4 takeout meals a week with home cooking saves most households around $2,000 a year. Not a rough estimate. That's a conservative calculation based on average meal costs. $2,000. Invested at a conservative 7% return over 20 years, that $2,000 per year becomes $87,000. Margaret didn't have a brokerage account. She had a pressure canner and a flour sack. But the mechanism is identical. You convert labor into savings. You invest the savings. Time does the rest. Running total, $2,000 per year. $87,000 over 20 years. And we're just getting started. There's a story the car industry doesn't advertise. The moment you drive a new car off the lot, it loses between 20 and 30% of its value. Not over time, immediately. in the distance between the dealership floor and the street. Margaret never bought a new car in her life. Not because she was poor. She eventually could afford one. She bought used because she had internalized a principle that Depression families understood viscerally. An item that has survived one owner has already proven it can survive another. The risk has been tested. The depreciation has already happened. You are buying the proven version. Today, the average new car payment in the United States is $735 per month. The average payment on a used car of equivalent function is $450. The difference, $285 per month, is $3,420 a year. Over 20 years, invested at 7%. That's $176,000. $176,000. Not from making a sacrifice, from simply refusing to pay for depreciation that someone else should absorb. Depression families didn't have a word for this. They just called it not being foolish. Running total now sits at roughly $263,000 over 20 years, just from two habits. But before we go to skill 3, I need to tell you something about what happened to these skills. Because understanding what was destroyed helps you understand why rebuilding it is so powerful. Between 1950 and 1975, something systematic happened to the American household. The consumer credit industry, banks, department stores, car manufacturers spent an estimated $40 billion in that period on advertising and lobbying designed to do one specific thing: make you feel that buying on credit was normal and that saving before purchasing was old-fashioned. They had a word for people like Margaret. They called them depression mentality. It was an insult. It meant you were so scarred by poverty that you couldn't enjoy life, that you were neurotic about money. What they didn't say is that the depression mentality had produced the most financially stable generation of middle-class Americans in history. The campaign worked. By 1980, personal savings rates had dropped from nearly 10% to under 6%. By 2005, they briefly went negative for the first time since the Depression itself. The system didn't fail. It performed exactly as designed. It extracted the savings margin from tens of millions of households and redirected it as interest payments to financial institutions. Margaret's skills weren't lost by accident. They were replaced. And what replaced them is the reason 37% of Americans can't cover $400 while sitting in cars with $700 monthly payments, eating $30 restaurant meals 3 times a week. Now, skill 3. In 1942, the U.S. government launched the Victory Garden campaign. At its peak, 20 million American families were growing their own food in backyards, rooftops, and vacant lots. Those gardens produced roughly 40% of the country's fresh vegetables. 40%. The government didn't do this because it was a nice lifestyle choice. They did it because they ran the numbers and realized that if households produced their own food, the supply chain burden dropped dramatically and household financial stability increased dramatically. Margaret had a garden that measured about 120 square feet, a parking space and a half. That garden produced, in her own accounting, which she kept in a notebook that her granddaughter still has, roughly $450 worth of produce per season in 1935 dollars. Adjusted for today, that's closer to $10,000 in produce value per season. Now, you're not going to grow $10,000 of vegetables in your backyard, but a well-managed 100-square-foot vegetable patch planted with high-yield crops, tomatoes, zucchini, beans, herbs, will produce between $600 and $900 worth of fresh produce per growing season, based on current grocery prices. Let's call it $700 a year. Invested over 20 years at 7%. $57,000. But here's the number nobody talks about. Research from the USDA's Economic Research Service found that households that grow their own food also spend measurably less at the grocery store in categories unrelated to their garden. The act of producing creates a mindset shift about consumption. You stop buying what you can make. You stop wasting what you grew. The garden doesn't just produce food, it produces a different relationship with money. Running total. $320,000 over 20 years. 3 skills, all of which Margaret was doing automatically by 1933, before she had any reason to think of them as wealth building. Skill 4 is the one that surprises people. In 1934, Margaret's neighbor Roy had a leaky roof. Roy was a carpenter who hadn't had paid work in 2 years. Margaret had a root cellar full of canned goods and a skill she'd learned from her mother. She could repair and resole leather shoes, a craft she'd picked up because new shoes were simply not an option. Roy fixed Margaret's fence, a job that would have cost several days of a tradesman's time. Margaret gave Roy 12 jars of preserved tomatoes, 4 jars of apple butter, and resoled 3 pairs of his children's shoes. No money changed hands. No platform took a cut. No taxes were owed. No receipt existed. What they exchanged was pure value, skill for skill, labor for labor, with zero friction. The New Deal archives at the National Archives preserve hundreds of documents describing these barter networks. They weren't informal accidents. In many communities, they were organized. There were ledgers. There were exchange rates. A day of carpentry traded for a set amount of preserved goods. A medical visit traded for hours of farm labor. Today, the same mechanism exists, but it's been quietly suppressed by a system that needs every transaction to be monetized, taxed, and intermediated. A graphic designer who trades a logo for a lawyer's contract review saves both parties roughly $300 to $800 each, the market rate for both services. A plumber who fixes a neighbor's leak in exchange for a year of bookkeeping services saves thousands on both ends. Margaret called this neighboring. She said it was the most important thing people had stopped doing by the time she was old. Research from the Journal of Consumer Research consistently shows that households embedded in reciprocal exchange networks report measurably lower annual expenses and higher perceived financial security than isolated households at the same income level. The number that matters here isn't in your bank account. It's in your network. Skill 5 is going to feel like it belongs in a home improvement video. It doesn't. It belongs in a psychology textbook. Because what Depression families understood about maintenance, and what modern consumer culture deliberately dismantled, is one of the most sophisticated pieces of behavioral economics ever identified. Margaret's cast iron stove lasted 41 years. She documented this. She cleaned it with a rag and a can of oil she bought once a year. She replaced one part in 4 decades. When she died, the stove was still working. This is not a story about frugality. It's a story about the compounding cost of neglect. The average American household replaces a major appliance every 7 to 9 years. Not because the appliance is dead, because it isn't maintained, so it breaks before its time. And because consumer culture has made replacement feel cheaper than repair, even when it isn't. A dishwasher that costs $900 and is replaced every 8 years costs the household $112 per year, before installation fees, disposal fees, and the opportunity cost of the cash spent. A dishwasher that costs $900 is properly maintained and runs for 25 years costs $36 per year. That delta, multiplied across a household's full inventory of maintained goods, refrigerator, washer, dryer, HVAC system, car, furniture, represents thousands of dollars annually. In 2012, researchers published a paper in the Journal of Economic Psychology using data from 11,700 households in the United Kingdom. They found that self-control, specifically the ability to delay gratification in consumer decisions, was one of the strongest predictors of financial stability. More predictive than income, more predictive than education, The households that repaired instead of replaced had not just better finances, they had better relationships, lower stress levels, and higher reported life satisfaction. Margaret didn't repair things because she had self-control. She repaired things because she had no choice. And that external constraint built a psychological architecture that paradoxically made her richer than generations who had every choice in the world. Proper maintenance saves the average household $500 a year in premature replacement costs. Invested over 20 years, $40,000. Running total, $360,000 over 20 years. 5 skills, all free to implement. Skill 6 doesn't grow your wealth. It protects everything the other skills build. After the crash of 1929, the United States experienced something that most people today can't fully imagine. Banks simply closed, not temporarily, permanently. Between 1930 and 1933, nearly 9,000 banks failed. People walked in one morning and their money was gone, not frozen, gone. Margaret's mother had kept money in 2 banks. She lost everything in both. Margaret never trusted a bank with her full reserves again. She kept a cash buffer, 3 months of household expenses in physical form. Some in the house, some with a trusted neighbor, some in a coat lining. She sewed herself. This wasn't paranoia. It was a direct lesson from watching her mother lose everything. The modern equivalent isn't hiding cash in your walls. It's maintaining a fully funded emergency reserve, separate from your investment accounts, accessible within 24 hours, never touched for anything that isn't a genuine emergency. The Federal Reserve data shows 37% of Americans cannot cover $400. Yet every financial crisis, every layoff, every medical emergency, every market crash hits the people without this buffer catastrophically harder. The person with 3 months of cash buffer does not sell their investments at the bottom of a crash. They wait. The person without it is forced to liquidate at exactly the wrong moment, locking in losses that take years to recover. The cash buffer doesn't appear in the running total because it doesn't generate wealth. It ensures that everything else you've built survives the moments when the world stops working correctly. We have one skill left, and it is the strangest one. It's not a financial action. It's a transmission. Something you do not for yourself, but for the people who come after you. Margaret Calloway considered it the most important thing she ever did. Margaret taught her children to keep a ledger, not a budget. A ledger. There's a difference. A budget is a plan. A ledger is a record. It shows you what actually happened, not what you intended. Every week, Margaret sat with her children, and they wrote down every penny that came in and every penny that went out. Not to punish, not to restrict, to make money visible. You can't protect what you can't see, she told her daughter Ruth in a letter preserved in the family's collection. And you can't see what no one taught you to look at. A study published in the Journal of Consumer Affairs found that adults whose parents regularly discussed money with them in childhood had significantly higher savings rates, lower debt levels, and made better long-term investment decisions than adults who received no financial education at home, regardless of income level. The transmission of practical financial knowledge is itself a form of inheritance. A teenager who understands compound interest, who knows the difference between an asset and a liability, who has seen a ledger and learned to keep one, begins adulthood with a 10 to 20-year head start over a teenager who didn't. Margaret's granddaughter, the one who still has the notebook, is a retired school teacher in Ohio. She owns her home outright. She has no debt. She is 81 years old and has never once had a financial emergency she couldn't cover from her own reserves. She credits the ledger. Not the ledger itself. The woman who sat down every week and made money visible and made sure her children learned to see it too. Let's close Margaret's ledger. $2,000 a year from cooking at home. $3,400 from buying used instead of new. $700 from the garden. hundreds more from barter and skill exchange, 500 from maintaining what she owned. Over 20 years, invested at a conservative 7%, those 5 concrete habits alone generate somewhere between $350,000 and $420,000 in cumulative wealth, on top of whatever income you already earn. That's not a theory, that's arithmetic, and none of it requires a brokerage account, a financial advisor, a degree, or a favorable market. It requires what Margaret had in 1932, the knowledge that the system was not designed to catch you and the decision to catch yourself. Here's what I want you to do right now. Pick one skill, just one. Not all 7, one. Cook one meal this week that you would have ordered. Or buy the used version of the next item on your list. Or start a ledger, literally any notebook. Write down what came in this week and what went out. That's how Margaret started. She didn't have a plan for 7 skills. She had $11 and the knowledge she grew up with. Knowledge that her mother had taught her, that her grandmother had taught her mother, passed down like a language that the whole culture had been slowly, deliberately talked out of speaking. You just got a piece of it back. If this changed how you see your own finances, subscribe. Because every week this channel goes deeper into the arithmetic that the system doesn't want you to do. And leave one comment. Which of these 7 skills are you starting with? I read every single one. The system changes. The knowledge you carry doesn't.